The smell of smoke curling through the open window was what first caught Xavier Pike's attention as he led his pack mule down the dusty street of Fort Benton, Montana Territory, on that sweltering August afternoon in 1878. After 3 months alone in the mountains trapping and hunting, the scent of burning anything should have been familiar, but this was different. This wasn't the controlled burn of a cooking fire or the deliberate clearing of land. This was the acrid, bitter smell of something gone terribly wrong. He pulled his mule to a stop outside a weathered cabin on the edge of town, his keen eyes scanning the source of the smoke. Through the window, he could see movement inside, and then he heard it. A sound that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the thin mountain air he was so accustomed to. Someone was crying. Not the loud, dramatic sobbing of a saloon girl trying to get attention, but the quiet, desperate weeping of someone who thought they were alone with their heartbreak. Xavier Pike was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. His dark hair hung past his collar, tangled from weeks in the wilderness, and his forearms were corded with muscle from swinging axes and hauling traps. His buckskin shirt stretched across a chest built from years of hard living in the mountains, and his hands were calloused and strong. Most people in town knew to give him a wide berth, not because he was cruel, but because he carried the quiet danger of a man who had survived things that would break lesser men. But that sound, those tears, they cut through every hard layer he had built around himself. He tied his mule quickly and approached the cabin door, knocking gently despite the urgency building in his chest. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a scrambling sound and a muffled gasp. "Who is it?" a woman's voice called out, thick with tears and something else. Fear, maybe, or shame. "Name's Xavier Pike, madam," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "I smelled smoke and wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything is fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the lie. Xavier shifted his weight, glancing back at the street. A few people were watching now, curious about the mountain man who rarely came to town, standing outside the Everett cabin. He knew the name because everyone in Fort Benton knew everyone else's business. Theodore Everett had died last spring, leaving behind a young widow who kept to herself. Xavier had never met her, having been in the mountains when it all happened. "Madam, I don't mean to intrude, but that smoke doesn't smell like everything's fine," he said carefully. There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door cracked open, revealing a sliver of a young woman's face. Even in that small glimpse, Xavier could see her eyes were red and swollen, her cheeks wet with tears. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a loose bun and the kind of delicate features that looked out of place in this rough territory. "I burned the bread," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I burned the bread, and I can't even do something as simple as baking." What kind of woman can't bake bread? Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and Xavier felt something shift in his chest. He had faced down grizzly bears and survived mountain lions. He had weathered blizzards that would freeze a man solid and heat that would bake him alive. But the sight of this woman's tears, the raw vulnerability in her voice, undid something in him he didn't even know was tied up. "Could I come in, madam?" he asked gently. "Maybe I could help." She hesitated, her green eyes studying him with a mixture of caution and desperation. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. Xavier removed his hat as he entered, ducking slightly through the doorframe. The cabin was small but clean, with simple furniture and curtains at the windows. On the table sat a pan with what could only charitably be called bread. It was black on top, sunken in the middle, and still smoking slightly. The smell was terrible, like someone had tried to turn flour into coal. The woman stood with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the ruined bread like it was the end of the world. "I have been trying for 6 weeks," she said, her voice hollow. 6 weeks, and I cannot make a single loaf that is fit to eat. Theodore always said I was a fine cook, but I think he was just being kind. Now he is gone, and I cannot even feed myself properly." Xavier set his hat on a chair and moved closer to the table, studying the bread. Up close, it was even worse than he had thought. But he had seen that look in her eyes, that desperate need to not be a complete failure at something, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. "You have a knife?" he asked. She blinked at him, confusion replacing some of the misery on her face. "What? A knife, madam?" "To cut the bread." "You cannot possibly want to eat that," she said, fresh tears welling up. "It is ruined. It is completely inedible." Xavier reached out and carefully picked up the pan, testing the weight of it. "I have eaten things that would make this look like a feast from a fancy hotel," he said, and it was true. "Where I come from, food is food, and wasting it is a sin greater than burning it." She stared at him like he had lost his mind, but she moved to a drawer and pulled out a knife. Her hands were shaking as she handed it to him. Xavier took it gently, making sure their fingers did not touch because something told him that even that small contact would spark something neither of them was ready for. He cut into the bread, the knife sawing through the burnt crust with difficulty. Inside, the bread was pale and gummy, underdone despite the blackened exterior. He cut a thick slice and lifted it to his mouth, aware that she was watching him with wide, disbelieving eyes. The bread tasted exactly like it looked. Bitter, burnt on the outside, raw and sticky on the inside. It was possibly the worst thing he had eaten in years, and he had once eaten a badger that had been dead for 3 days. But he chewed slowly, swallowed, and then looked at her with complete sincerity. "Tastes just like heaven," he said. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then her face crumpled and she started crying again, but this time it was different. These tears were mixed with laughter, a half-hysterical sound that filled the small cabin. "You are lying," she said, but she was almost smiling through her tears. "You are the worst liar I have ever met." Xavier cut another piece and took another bite, maintaining his serious expression. "I have been in the mountains for 3 months, madam. I have eaten nothing but jerky and whatever I could shoot. This bread, burnt as it may be, was made by human hands in a real kitchen. That makes it taste like heaven to me." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and for the first time since he had entered the cabin, she really looked at him. He saw the moment her expression shifted from grief to curiosity, her eyes traveling over his broad shoulders, his sun-darkened skin, the rough edges that marked him as a man of the wilderness. "Why are you being so kind?" she asked softly. Xavier set down the knife and met her gaze directly. "Because I know what it is like to feel like you are failing at something that should be simple," he said honestly. "And because no woman should have to cry alone over burnt bread." She drew in a shaky breath and then, surprising them both, she laughed. It was a small, tentative sound, but it was genuine. "My name is Thea," she said. "Thea Everett." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Everett," Xavier said, inclining his head respectfully. "Just Thea," she corrected quietly. "Theodore has been gone for 4 months now. I suppose I am still adjusting to being alone." Xavier noticed the way her voice caught on her late husband's name, the shadow that crossed her face. "How did he pass, if you do not mind me asking?" "Fever," she said, moving to sit in one of the chairs at the table. She looked exhausted suddenly, like the weight of the last months was pressing down on her all at once. It happened very quickly. One day he was fine, and 3 days later he was gone. We had only been married a year. We came out here to start fresh, to build something together, and then She trailed off, staring at the ruined bread. Xavier felt a surge of sympathy for her. She was so young to be a widow, so unprepared for the harsh realities of life in the territory. "And the bread," he prompted gently. Thea let out a long breath. "Theodore always did the baking. I cooked other things, but he enjoyed making bread. He said it reminded him of his mother. After he died, I realized I had never paid attention to how he did it. I have been using his recipe, but something always goes wrong. Today I fell asleep while it was baking because I was up all night with Mrs. Henderson down the street. Her baby was coming and she needed help." Xavier sat down across from her, the chair creaking under his weight. "You were up all night helping deliver a baby, and then you tried to bake bread," she nodded miserably. "I need to sell the bread to make money. Theodore's savings are nearly gone, and I cannot live off charity forever. Mrs. Henderson cannot pay me in coin for helping with the birth, but she trades eggs when she can. I thought if I could bake bread to sell, I could manage." Understanding dawned on Xavier. This was not just about burnt bread. This was about survival, about a young widow trying to find her footing in a world that had suddenly become much harder and lonelier. "What if I could help you?" he found himself saying before he had really thought it through. Thea looked up at him, surprise evident on her face. "Help me how?" "I know how to bake bread," Xavier said, which was true. He had learned from his own mother before she passed, and years of living alone in the mountains had made him proficient at basic cooking. "I could teach you. And in the meantime, if you need money, I could use someone to help me prepare my furs for sale. I have 3 months' worth of pelts that need cleaning and stretching. It is work, but I would pay fairly." She stared at him like he had just offered her the moon. "You would do that? But you do not even know me." Xavier met her gaze steadily. "I know you are a woman who cries over burnt bread because you are trying so hard to survive on your own. I know you spent all night helping someone else even though you are struggling yourself. That tells me enough." Thea's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different. These were tears of relief, of unexpected hope. "I do not know what to say." "Say yes," Xavier said simply. "Say you will let me help." She nodded, a small smile breaking through despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes." "Thank you, Mr. Pike. Thank you so much." "Xavier," he corrected. "If we are going to be working together, it should be Xavier." "Xavier," she repeated, and he liked the way his name sounded in her soft voice. They spent the rest of that afternoon in her cabin. Xavier finished eating every bite of the burnt bread, partly because he had committed to it, and partly because the joy on Thea's face, each time he took another bite, was worth the terrible taste. Then he helped her clean up the kitchen, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. As the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold, Xavier prepared to leave. He stood at the door, hat in hand, looking down at Thea. She seemed smaller next to him, more delicate, but there was strength in her too. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way she held herself despite the day's disasters. "I will bring the furs by tomorrow morning," he said. "And we can start on the bread in the afternoon, once the heat of the day has passed." "I will be here," Thea said, and then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his arm, her small hand resting briefly on his forearm. Even through the buckskin, he could feel the warmth of her touch. "Thank you, Xavier, truly. Today was one of my darkest days, and you turned it into something different, something better." Xavier looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. In the golden light of sunset, she looked almost ethereal, and he felt something shift in his chest again, something dangerous and wonderful all at once. "Sleep well, Thea," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Then he stepped out into the evening, leaving her standing in the doorway with a small smile on her face. As he led his mule to the boarding house where he kept a room for his rare visits to town, Xavier found himself thinking about green eyes and burnt bread, and the sound of a woman's laughter. He had come to Fort Benton to sell his furs and stock up on supplies before heading back into the mountains. He had not planned on getting involved with anyone, especially not a young widow with tears in her eyes. But plans changed, he thought, glancing back at the small cabin one more time before turning the corner. Sometimes they changed when you least expected it. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching day typical of Montana in late summer. Xavier was up before sunrise, washing in the basin in his room and running his fingers through his long hair. He caught his reflection in the small mirror above the dresser and barely recognized himself. There was something different in his eyes, an anticipation he had not felt in years. He gathered his furs, loading them onto his mule with practiced efficiency. They represented months of hard work, and they would fetch a good price. But his mind was not on the money as he made his way through the awakening town to Thea's cabin. His mind was on her face when she had laughed through her tears, on the way she had thanked him with such genuine gratitude. He knocked on her door just as the sun was cresting the horizon, painting the world in soft pinks and golds. Thea opened it almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. She was dressed simply in a faded blue calico dress, her hair neatly braided, and her face freshly scrubbed. She looked young and pretty and nervous all at once. "Good morning," she said, stepping back to let him in. "I have been up for hours. I could not sleep." Xavier carried the heavy bundles of furs inside, setting them carefully on the floor. "Nervous?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "I have never worked with furs before. What if I ruin them?" "You will not," Xavier said with certainty. "I will show you how. It is not difficult, just time-consuming. The most important thing is patience and attention to detail." They spent the morning working together at the small table, Xavier's large hands guiding Thea's smaller ones through the process of cleaning and preparing the pelts. He explained each step carefully, showing her how to scrape away any remaining flesh without damaging the fur, how to stretch the hides properly to preserve them. Thea was a quick learner, her fingers nimble despite her inexperience. Xavier found himself watching her more than he should, noticing small things. The way she bit her lower lip when she concentrated. The way a loose strand of hair kept falling into her face, and she would blow it away with an impatient breath. The way her eyes lit up when she got something right. "You are good at this," he said after she had successfully prepared her third pelt. She looked up at him, pleasure evident on her face. "Really, really," he confirmed. "You have steady hands and good instincts. These will sell well." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the scraping of their tools and the occasional comment from Xavier about technique. Outside, the town was coming fully alive, the sounds of horses and wagons and voices drifting through the open window. "Tell me about the mountains," Thea said suddenly, not looking up from her work. "What is it like to live up there alone?" Xavier considered the question, his hands continuing their practiced movements. "Quiet," he said finally. "So quiet you can hear your own heartbeat." The first few weeks are always the hardest because you realize how much noise people make, how much you depend on that noise to feel connected to the world. But then you adjust, and the quiet becomes peaceful instead of lonely. "You never get lonely?" she asked, glancing at him. He met her eyes, seeing genuine curiosity there. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially in winter when the snows are deep and you cannot travel. But I learned a long time ago that being alone and being lonely are not always the same thing." Thea nodded slowly, understanding in her expression. "I know what you mean. I have been surrounded by people since Theodore died. Everyone in town has been so kind, bringing food and offering help, but I have never felt lonelier in my life." Xavier understood that too. He had felt that way after his father died, leaving him to run their small ranch alone at 16. The loneliness of grief was different from the loneliness of solitude. "How did you end up in the mountains?" Thea asked, setting down her tool and giving him her full attention. "My father had a ranch about 20 miles from here," Xavier said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. He rarely talked about his past. "After he died, I tried to keep it running, but I was young and I made mistakes. Eventually, I lost it to debt. I was bitter and angry and I did not want to be around people anymore, so I headed into the mountains to trap. That was almost 8 years ago. And you have been alone ever since?" Thea asked softly. "Mostly," Xavier said. "I come to town a few times a year to sell furs and buy supplies. Sometimes I winter with the Blackfeet tribe further north. But yes, mostly alone." Thea was quiet for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "Does it make you happy?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. "It makes me free," he said carefully. "Whether that is the same as happy, I am not sure." She nodded, seeming to accept this. "Theodore wanted us to have a farm eventually. He had so many plans. Sometimes I think about leaving, going back east where I have family, but then I feel like I would be abandoning his dreams." "His dreams are not yours to carry," Xavier said gently. "You have to find your own." Thea looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "What would your dreams be, Xavier, if you could have anything?" He opened his mouth to give some easy answer but found he could not lie to her. "I do not know any more," he said honestly. "For a long time my dream was just to survive, to make it through another winter, another season. But lately I have started to wonder if that is enough." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken understanding. Then Thea smiled, breaking the tension. "Well, maybe we can both figure out what our dreams are, together I mean, as friends. Friends. Yes, that was safe, that was acceptable." Xavier returned her smile. "I would like that." They worked through the rest of the morning, falling into an easy rhythm. Xavier found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around people. The usual tension that kept his shoulders tight and his guard up slowly melting away. There was something about Thea that made him feel comfortable, made him want to open up in ways he had not done in years. When the afternoon heat became too oppressive for working with furs, they took a break. Thea brought out water and some cold chicken left over from a neighbor's charity, and they sat together at the table, eating and talking. "Tell me about growing up on the ranch," Thea said, her chin propped on her hand as she listened. Xavier found himself sharing stories he had not thought about in years. He told her about his mother teaching him to bake bread on cold winter mornings, about his father teaching him to track deer through the forest, about the simple pleasures of ranch life before everything fell apart. Thea listened with rapt attention, asking questions and laughing at the funny parts. In turn, she told him about her own childhood in Ohio, about how she had met Theodore when he came through her town as a surveyor, about the whirlwind courtship that had led her to Montana territory. She spoke of her late husband with fondness, but without the deep grief Xavier had expected, and he realized that theirs had been a marriage of convenience more than passion. "Theodore was a good man," Thea said quietly, "kind and patient and steady. But I think we both knew we had married for practical reasons more than love. He wanted a wife to help build his future out here, and I wanted adventure and escape from a life that felt too small. We cared for each other, but it was not." She trailed off, searching for words. "Not the kind of love that burns," Xavier finished for her, understanding what she meant. "Yes," she said, looking relieved that he understood. "Does that make me terrible, to say that about my dead husband?" "No," Xavier said firmly. "It makes you honest." She smiled at him gratefully, and he felt that shift in his chest again. that dangerous flutter that warned him he was getting too close, caring too much. As the afternoon cooled slightly, Xavier kept his promise to teach Thea to bake bread. They stood side by side in her small kitchen, Xavier's large frame taking up most of the space as he guided her through the process step by step. "The trick is in the kneading," he explained, demonstrating with his strong hands working the dough. "You have to fold and press, until it becomes smooth and elastic, like this." He handed the dough to Thea, who began working it with determination. Xavier stood close, watching her technique, occasionally reaching out to adjust her hand position. Each time his fingers brushed hers, he felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with bread and everything to do with the woman beside him. "How long do I knead it?" Thea asked, slightly breathless from the effort. "Until your arms feel like they might fall off," Xavier said with a slight smile. "Or about 10 minutes, whichever comes first." Thea laughed, the sound filling the small kitchen with warmth. 10 minutes it is, then." They worked together through each step, kneading the dough until it was perfect, letting it rise in a warm spot near the stove, shaping it into loaves with gentle hands. Xavier found himself acutely aware of every moment, every small touch, every shared glance. This was dangerous territory, he knew. Thea was still grieving, still vulnerable, and he had no business developing feelings for her. But feelings, he was learning, did not follow the rules of logic or propriety. When the bread finally came out of the oven, golden brown and fragrant, Thea let out a sound of pure joy. "It is perfect," she breathed, staring at the loaves like they were made of gold. "Xavier, it is actually perfect." Without thinking, she threw her arms around him in a spontaneous hug. Xavier stood frozen for a moment, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides, her slender body pressed against his larger frame. Then, slowly, he allowed himself to return the embrace, his big hands settling gently on her back. She fit perfectly against him, he realized, like she was made to be there. Thea pulled back quickly, her cheeks flushing pink. "I am sorry," she said, flustered. "I did not mean to be so forward, I was just so happy." "Do not apologize," Xavier said, his voice rough. "I am glad you are happy." They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with something new and electric. Then Thea turned back to the bread, breaking the moment, and Xavier released a breath he had not realized he was holding. They cut into the bread together, the knife sliding through the perfect crust to reveal soft, airy crumb inside. Xavier took a bite, and this time he did not have to lie. "This actually does taste like heaven," he said with a genuine smile. Thea beamed at him, her whole face lighting up with pride and joy. In that moment, with flour on her cheek and happiness in her eyes, Xavier thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The days that followed fell into a comfortable pattern. Xavier would arrive at Thea's cabin early each morning, and they would work together on the furs until the afternoon heat drove them inside. Then they would bake bread, Xavier teaching and Thea learning, their hands and shoulders brushing in the small kitchen. In the evenings, they would sit on her small porch, watching the sun set over the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. Xavier found himself lingering longer each day, finding excuses to stay just a little while more. He told himself it was because the work was not finished, because Thea still needed his guidance. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He did not want to leave her. Thea, for her part, seemed to bloom under his attention. The sad, desperate woman he had found crying over burnt bread was transforming into someone more confident, more alive. She laughed more easily now, her smiles coming quick and genuine. She had started selling her bread to some of the other families in town, and the small income it provided made her stand a little taller. But there were moments, small stolen moments, when Xavier caught her watching him with an expression he did not quite know how to interpret. Longing, maybe. Or curiosity. Or something deeper that scared him because he felt it too. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after that first day with the burnt bread, they were sitting on her porch as usual. The air was cooler now, a hint of the coming autumn in the breeze. Thea had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and Xavier sat on the steps, his long legs stretched out before him. "Xavier," Thea said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said, looking up at her. "Why did you really help me that day?" she asked. "You said it was because you knew what it was like to fail, but I think there is more to it than that." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. He could lie, give her some easy explanation, but he was tired of lying, even to himself. "Because the world is hard enough without facing it alone," he said finally. "Because I have spent 8 years convincing myself that I did not need anyone, that being alone was better, safer. But then I heard you crying and something in me broke open. I realized I was tired of being alone." Thea's breath caught softly. "And now?" she asked. "Are you still tired of it?" Xavier stood, moving to sit beside her on the porch rail, close but not quite touching. "Now I am terrified," he admitted. "Because I have been alone so long, I do not know how to be anything else. But when I am with you, I want to try. I want to learn." Thea reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and took his hand in both of hers. Her hands were so small compared to his, delicate and soft where his were rough and scarred, but they fit together perfectly. "I am terrified too," she whispered. "Theodore has only been gone for months. People would say it is too soon, that I should be in mourning longer, but I feel alive for the first time since he died. Maybe for the first time ever, and it is because of you." Xavier turned his hand over, threading his fingers through hers. "I do not care what people say," he said firmly. "I only care about what you want, what you feel." Thea looked up at him, her green eyes shining in the fading light. "I feel like I've been waiting for you my whole life. Like everything that happened before was just leading me to that day when you walked through my door and ate my terrible bread." Xavier lifted his free hand slowly, giving her every chance to stop him, and gently cupped her cheek. His palm completely covered the side of her face, his calloused thumb brushing away a strand of hair that had escaped her braid. "Thea," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I am not good at pretty words or proper courting. I am a mountain man who has spent years living like an animal in the wilderness. But I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. It is the most real thing I have ever felt." "Then kiss me," Thea breathed. "Please, Xavier, kiss me." He leaned in slowly, watching her eyes flutter closed, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if both of them were afraid of breaking something precious. But then Thea made a small sound in the back of her throat and pressed closer, and Xavier deepened the kiss, his hand sliding from her cheek to tangle in her hair. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know it is fast and probably foolish, but it is true." Thea laughed softly, tears sliding down her cheeks, but these were happy tears, joyful tears. "I am falling in love with you too," she said. "I think I started falling that very first day when you ate that terrible bread and told me it tasted like heaven." They sat together on the porch long into the night, holding hands and stealing kisses and talking about the future. For the first time in 8 years, Xavier allowed himself to think beyond the next season, the next winter, the next lonely stretch of mountains. He allowed himself to imagine a life with this woman, a home that was not just a temporary shelter but a place where he belonged. The next weeks passed in a blur of work and growing affection. Xavier and Thea finished preparing all his furs, and he sold them for a good price. Instead of immediately buying supplies and heading back into the mountains as he usually did, he found himself staying in Fort Benton, finding reasons to remain near Thea. They courted properly, as much as the small town allowed. Xavier would escort Thea to church on Sundays, enduring the curious stares and whispered gossip about the mountain man and the young widow. They would walk together along the Missouri River in the evenings, Xavier's hand warm and steady at the small of Thea's back. Sometimes they would simply sit in her cabin, working on small tasks while talking about their pasts, their hopes, their dreams. The physical attraction between them grew stronger with each passing day, each stolen kiss becoming more heated, more desperate. But Xavier was careful to maintain propriety, knowing that Thea's reputation was already fragile as a young widow. He would not compromise her further, no matter how much he wanted her. It was Thea who finally broached the subject one evening in late September as they sat in her cabin, the first cold snap of autumn making the fire necessary. They had been kissing on her small sofa, Xavier's arms wrapped around her slender frame, when she pulled back and looked at him with serious eyes. "Xavier," she said breathlessly, "I want to marry you." He went very still, his heart pounding in his chest. "Thea, are you sure?" "It has only been 5 months since Theodore died. People will talk." "Let them talk," she said firmly. "I do not care anymore. I have wasted enough of my life worrying about what other people think. I know what I feel and I know what I want. I want you. I want to be your wife." Xavier searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty, but all he saw was conviction and love shining in her green eyes. "I have nothing to offer you," he said roughly. "No house, no land, just a room at the boarding house and a life in the mountains. You deserve better." Thea reached up and cupped his bearded face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You are offering me yourself," she said. "That is everything I want. We will figure out the rest together." Xavier closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, feeling something tight and painful in his chest finally loosen. "Then yes," he said, opening his eyes to look at her. "Yes, I will marry you as soon as you want." Thea smiled, radiant and beautiful. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want to marry you tomorrow." Xavier laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "Tomorrow it is, then." They were married the next afternoon by the town minister, with only a handful of witnesses present. Xavier wore the only clean shirt he owned, his long hair tied back, his face freshly shaved for the occasion. Thea wore a simple dress of pale yellow, her hair braided with wildflowers Xavier had gathered that morning from the hills outside town. As they stood before the minister, Xavier holding Thea's small hands in his much larger ones, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This woman, this beautiful, brave woman who had been crying over burnt bread just weeks ago, was about to become his wife. It seemed impossible, miraculous, and yet completely inevitable. "I do," Thea said when prompted, her voice clear and strong, her eyes never leaving Xavier's face. "I do," Xavier repeated, his deep voice filling the small church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier pulled Thea into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that they had an audience, not caring about anything except the woman in his arms and the life stretching out before them. That night, in Thea's small cabin that was now their home, Xavier made love to his wife for the first time. He was gentle and patient, taking his time to explore every inch of her soft skin, determined to make it good for her. Thea responded to his touch with a passion that surprised them both, her hands clutching his broad shoulders, her soft cries filling the darkness. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in her narrow bed, Thea's head resting on Xavier's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." Xavier pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I love you too," he said, "more than I knew it was possible to love someone." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time in 8 years, Xavier did not dream of lonely mountains and empty skies. He dreamed of home. The following weeks were a period of adjustment as they learned to live together as husband and wife. Xavier's large frame took up most of the space in the small cabin, and Thea teased him about being like a bear trying to live in a dollhouse. But they made it work, rearranging furniture and finding creative solutions to the space constraints. The more pressing question was what they would do for money once Xavier's fur money ran out. They could not live on bread sales alone, and Xavier was reluctant to leave Thea alone while he spent months in the mountains trapping. They needed a plan, a sustainable way to build a life together. It was Thea who came up with the idea one morning as they lay in bed, the autumn sun streaming through the window. "What if we started a trading post?" she suggested, propped up on one elbow to look down at him. "You know the trappers and the mountain men. You know what they need and what they will pay for, and I could manage the store while you make supply runs or trading expeditions." Xavier considered the idea, his fingers tracing idle patterns on Thea's bare shoulder. "It would take capital to start," he said slowly. "We would need a building, inventory, supplies. We could use the money from your furs as a start," Thea said, warming to the idea. "And perhaps take a loan for the rest. There is that empty building on Main Street, the one that used to be a dry goods store. It has been vacant since the owner moved back east." The more they talked about it, the more excited Xavier became. A trading post would allow him to use his knowledge of the mountains and the trappers while staying close to Thea. It would give them both purpose and a way to build something together. It felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. They spent the next several weeks working toward their goal. Xavier negotiated with the owner of the empty building, using his reputation and connections to secure a favorable lease. Thea threw herself into planning, making lists of inventory they would need, drawing up a layout for the store. They took a small loan from the town bank, the banker reluctantly agreeing after Xavier explained their business plan with quiet confidence. By the time the first snow fell in November, Pike's trading post was open for business. It was a modest operation, but it was theirs. Xavier had built sturdy shelves along the walls and a long counter across the back. Thea had organized the inventory with meticulous care, everything from traps and ammunition to flour and fabric neatly arranged and labeled. Word spread quickly among the trappers and mountain men in the area that one of their own had opened a trading post. Xavier's reputation for honesty and fair dealing brought in customers from the first day. Thea charmed them all with her friendly manner and sharp mind for business, quickly learning to negotiate trades and sales with the skill of a seasoned merchant. The trading post became a gathering place for the trappers coming down from the mountains, a place where they could stock up on supplies and share stories and news. Xavier found himself enjoying the social aspect more than he had expected, though he was careful never to stay away from Thea's side for too long. He liked having her near, like being able to look up from whatever he was doing and see her across the store. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she calculated a total, or her face lit up with a smile as she greeted a customer. Winter in Fort Benton was harsh that year, with deep snows and bitter cold that kept most people close to their fires. But the trading post remained busy, serving the hardy souls who still ventured out. Xavier and Thea would close the store each evening and retire to the small room they had built in the back of the building. A cozy space with a bed and a stove and everything they needed. On those long winter nights, they would lie together in their bed, listening to the wind howl outside, talking about their plans and dreams. Thea spoke of eventually expanding the trading post, maybe adding ready-made clothes or other luxury goods. Xavier talked about building them a proper house come spring, something bigger than the cabin or the room at the trading post, a place where they could truly put down roots. "You want children?" Thea asked one night, her head resting on Xavier's chest as always. Xavier's hand stilled where it had been stroking her hair. "I do," he said carefully. "Do you?" "Yes," Thea said softly. "I think I would like that very much. A son with your strength and your kind heart, or a daughter with your beautiful eyes." Xavier pulled her closer, emotion tightening his throat. "A daughter with your spirit and your courage," he countered. "Or a son with your sharp mind and your warm heart." Thea laughed softly. "We will have to have several then to get all those qualities." "Several sounds perfect," Xavier agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. Spring came late to Montana Territory in 1879, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal and possibility. The trading post had done better than either Xavier or Thea had dared hope, and they were able to pay off their loan and still have money left over. Xavier hired a carpenter and began building a house on a piece of land just outside town, working alongside the carpenter from dawn to dusk to get it finished. Thea spent her days managing the trading post, which she had essentially taken over as Xavier focused on the house. She had a natural talent for business, Xavier realized, a way of making people feel welcome while still driving a hard bargain. The trappers respected her, and the townspeople had slowly begun to accept her marriage to Xavier, seeing how well-suited they were to each other. In May, Thea discovered she was pregnant. She told Xavier one evening as they stood together surveying the progress on their house, the frame already up and the roof partially completed. "We are going to have a baby," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. Xavier went very still, his blue eyes wide with shock and joy. "A baby," he repeated as if he could not quite believe it. "A baby," Thea confirmed, smiling up at him. "In early winter, the doctor thinks." Xavier let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile radius and swept Thea up in his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and protested that he would make her dizzy. When he finally set her down, there were tears in his eyes, tough mountain man that he was. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "Thea, I am going to be a father." "Yes, you are," she said, reaching up to wipe away his tears. "And you are going to be wonderful at it, just like you are wonderful at everything else you do." The next months passed in a flurry of activity. Xavier worked even harder on the house, driven by a new urgency to have it finished before the baby came. The house was bigger than either of them had initially planned, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a large main room downstairs, a proper kitchen, and even a small study where Thea could keep the trading post books. By August, they were able to move in, and Thea spent happy weeks making it into a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and rugs for the floors. Xavier built furniture with his own hands, a large bed for their room, a cradle for the baby, a table and chairs for the kitchen. Everything was simple but sturdy, built to last. Thea's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the late summer heat made her uncomfortable. Xavier was attentive to her every need, sometimes almost comically so, jumping to fetch her water or a cushion before she even asked. She would tease him about being overprotective, but secretly she loved it, loved feeling so cherished and cared for. One evening in September, They sat together on the porch of their new house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Thea's belly was round now, the baby active inside her. Xavier had his hand resting gently on her stomach, marveling each time he felt movement. "You remember the day we met?" Thea asked softly. "When you found me crying over that terrible burnt bread?" "Of course I remember," Xavier said. "How could I forget? That was the day my whole life changed." "Mine too," Thea said, covering his hand with hers. "I was at my lowest point that day. I thought I had nothing left, no future, no hope. And then you walked in and ate that awful bread and told me it tasted like heaven. You saved me that day, Xavier. In every way a person can be saved." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You saved me too," he said. "I had been lost for so long I did not even realize it anymore. I thought I was fine living alone in the mountains, cut off from everything and everyone. But I was just surviving, not living. You taught me the difference." Thea leaned against his solid shoulder, feeling completely content. "We saved each other then," she said. "We did," Xavier agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." In December, with snow already deep on the ground and winter settling in hard, Thea went into labor. Xavier had arranged for the town doctor to be on call, and he sent for him immediately when Thea's pain started. But babies come on their own schedule, and this one was in a hurry. Xavier ended up delivering his own son with shaking hands, and the doctor's instructions shouted from downstairs, as the man was still pulling off his snowy coat. It was the most terrifying and amazing experience of Xavier's life, watching his child come into the world, hearing that first lusty cry, seeing Thea's exhausted, radiant face. They named him Matthew, after Xavier's father, and from the moment Xavier held him for the first time, he knew his heart had grown to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. The baby was perfect, with a strong grip and Xavier's blue eyes and a healthy set of lungs that he used frequently, especially at night. Those first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful and occasionally maddening. Xavier, who had faced down grizzly bears and survived mountain winters, found himself completely undone by a crying infant. But he learned, they both learned, fumbling their way through feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights. Thea was a natural mother, patient and gentle but also firm when needed. Xavier watched her with their son and fell even more in love with her, if that was possible. She would sit in the rocking chair he had built, nursing Matthew while humming softly, and Xavier would watch from the doorway, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling he had for his little family. The trading post continued to thrive, now being run primarily by Thea with help from a young clerk Xavier had hired. Xavier still dealt with the trappers and handled the supply runs, but he made sure he was never gone from home for more than a few days at a time. He could not stand to be away from Thea and Matthew longer than that. As Matthew grew from an infant to a toddler, Xavier found himself thinking about the future more and more. He wanted more children, brothers and sisters for Matthew. He wanted to expand the trading post, maybe even open another one in a different town. He wanted to build onto their house, add a proper barn and maybe some livestock. He had plans now, dreams, things he wanted to accomplish not just for himself but for his family. One evening when Matthew was nearly 2 years old, Xavier and Thea sat together on their porch, watching their son toddle around the yard, chasing fireflies in the summer twilight. Thea was pregnant again, this time with what the doctor assured them was likely a girl based on how she was carrying. "Are you happy?" Xavier asked, the same question Thea had asked him so long ago in her cabin. Thea looked at him, her green eyes soft with love. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she said honestly. When I think about that day you found me crying over burnt bread, it feels like a lifetime ago. Like I was a different person." "You were," Xavier said, reaching over to take her hand. "We both were. We grew into the people we were meant to be, together." "Together," Thea agreed, squeezing his hand. "Always together." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1881, a healthy girl with Thea's honey-colored hair and Xavier's strong features. They named her Sarah, after Thea's mother, and she completed their family in a way neither of them had quite expected. Matthew was enchanted with his baby sister, always wanting to help care for her, to hold her and bring her toys. The years that followed were full and rich. The trading post became one of the most successful businesses in Fort Benton, and Xavier's reputation as an honest dealer brought trappers and traders from all over the territory. They expanded the building, adding more inventory and hiring more help. Xavier built the barn he had dreamed of and bought some cattle and horses. He discovered he liked ranching almost as much as he had liked trapping, though in a different way. It was good, honest work that let him stay close to home and his family. Thea became a prominent figure in Fort Benton society, serving on committees and organizing events. But she never forgot where she came from, always ready to help a widow in need or a family struggling to get by. She often told the story of the day Xavier found her crying over burnt bread, using it to encourage others that no situation was hopeless, that help could come from the most unexpected places. Matthew grew into a strong, capable boy with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's quick mind. Sarah was a spirited child, fearless and curious, always getting into something. Xavier and Thea added 2 more children to their family over the years, another son they named Thomas, and a second daughter they named Catherine. Xavier found that fatherhood suited him in ways he never would have imagined during his lonely years in the mountains. He loved teaching his children, loved watching them grow and learn. He taught Matthew and Thomas to track and hunt and work with their hands. He taught Sarah and Catherine that they could do anything their brothers could do and probably do it better. But it was the quiet moments he treasured most. Evening meals with his whole family gathered around the table. Bedtime stories with children piled on the bed around him. Lazy Sunday afternoons on the porch with Thea by his side and their children playing in the yard. These were the moments that made all the hard years, all the loneliness and struggle, worthwhile. One day in the summer of 1890, Xavier and Thea took a rare afternoon to themselves, leaving the children with trusted friends in town. They rode horses up into the foothills, to a spot Xavier had discovered years ago during his trapping days. It overlooked the valley where Fort Benton sat, with the Missouri River winding through it like a silver ribbon. They sat together on a blanket, Thea leaning back against Xavier's chest, his arms wrapped around her. They were both older now, with silver beginning to show in their hair and lines around their eyes. But the connection between them was as strong as ever, maybe even stronger for having weathered the trials and triumphs of over a decade together. "You ever miss it?" Thea asked quietly. "The mountains, the solitude, the freedom of your old life." Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted. "Life was harder in some ways but simpler. But no, I do not miss being alone. I could never go back to that now. Not after knowing what it is to love you, to have a family, to have a home." Thea turned in his arms to look at him. "I love you, Xavier Pike," she said. "I loved you from the moment you sat in my kitchen and ate that terrible bread and made me believe that everything might actually be okay." Xavier cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "And I love you, Thea Pike, more than anything else in this world. You and our children are my whole life." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, a kiss that held over a decade of love and devotion and partnership. When they pulled apart, Thea had tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said, smiling. "I think about how that bread was so terrible, how much of a disaster that whole day was, and I think about how it turned out to be the best day of my life. Because if I had not burned that bread, if I had not been crying, you might have just ridden past my cabin. We might never have met." Xavier thought about that, about all the tiny chance occurrences that had led them to each other. Him coming to town that particular day. Her burning the bread at just that moment. Him hearing her tears through the window. Any one of those things might have been different, and they never would have found each other. "I do not believe that," he said finally. "I think we were always meant to find each other. Maybe not that exact way, maybe not that exact day, but somehow, somewhere we would have met. Some things are just meant to be." Thea nodded, believing it too. They sat together for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, talking about their children, their business, their dreams for the future. They talked about growing old together, about watching their children grow up and have families of their own, about all the years still ahead of them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, they reluctantly gathered their things to head home. Their children would be wondering where they were, and there was always so much to do. But they rode back slowly, hand in hand, savoring these precious moments of quiet togetherness. That night, after the children were all asleep and the house was quiet, Xavier and Thea lay together in their bed, the same bed Xavier had built with his own hands all those years ago. Moonlight streamed through the window, silvering everything it touched. "Xavier." Thea whispered into the darkness. "Yes, love," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "Thank you for eating my burnt bread." Xavier smiled in the darkness, remembering that day, that terrible, wonderful day that had changed everything. "Best meal I ever had," he said, and meant it with his whole heart. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. The trading post continued to prosper, eventually expanding to include a second location in a nearby town. Matthew, as the eldest, showed a natural aptitude for business and began helping more with the trading posts as he grew into young manhood. Thomas preferred working with the animals and took over most of the ranch operations. Sarah surprised everyone by showing a talent for numbers and record keeping, eventually managing all the financial aspects of the family businesses. Catherine, the youngest, had inherited her mother's way with people and became the face of the trading posts, greeting customers and negotiating deals with charm and skill. Xavier watched his children grow with pride and occasional amazement that these capable young people had come from him and Thea. He saw the best of both of them in each child, different combinations of their traits and talents. As his children began courting and marrying, starting families of their own, Xavier found himself becoming a grandfather. The first time Matthew placed his newborn son in Xavier's arms, Xavier felt that same overwhelming love he had felt when holding his own children for the first time. It was different, somehow softer and less terrifying, but no less profound. Thea took to being a grandmother with the same natural grace she brought to everything. She loved having the grandbabies around, teaching them to bake bread just as Xavier had once taught her. Sometimes Xavier would walk into the kitchen and find Thea with one of the grandchildren, small hands covered in flour, and his heart would clench with the sheer perfection of the moment. On a crisp autumn day in 1903, Xavier and Thea celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the house for a big celebration, and the place was full of noise and laughter and love. Xavier stood on the porch, watching it all, feeling grateful beyond words for the life he had been given. Thea came out to join him, slipping her hand into his. She was in her late 50s now, her honey hair more silver than gold, her face lined with the evidence of a life well lived. But to Xavier, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, leaning against him as she had done 1,000 times before. "About how lucky I am," Xavier said simply. "About how one day, one moment, one decision can change everything." "The day you ate my burnt bread," Thea said with a smile. "The day I ate your burnt bread," Xavier agreed. "Best decision I ever made." Inside, someone called for them, wanting to make a toast. But they stood there for just a moment longer, hand in hand, looking out at the life they had built together. A life that had started with burnt bread and tears, and a mountain man who had been willing to see past the disaster to the woman underneath. A life that had grown into something neither of them could have imagined that day. "Come on," Thea said finally, tugging his hand. "Our family is waiting." Xavier followed her inside, into the warmth and noise and love, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He had spent years in the mountains believing that solitude was freedom, but he had been wrong. This was freedom. This love, this family, this life they had created together. This was everything. As the years advanced, Xavier and Thea settled into the comfortable rhythms of their later life. They gradually handed over more responsibility for the trading posts and the ranch to their children, trusting them to carry on what they had built. They spent more time together, just the two of them, finding joy in simple things. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks around their property, Sunday dinners with the ever-growing family. Xavier's body bore the marks of his hard life. His shoulders were not quite as broad as they once had been, his movements not quite as quick. But his hands were still strong, and his mind was still sharp, and his love for Thea had not diminished one bit with age. Thea moved a little slower now, and some mornings her hands ached with arthritis. But her spirit was as fierce as ever, her kindness undiminished by age. She still baked bread every week, though now she did it more for the pleasure of it than out of necessity. One evening in the spring of 1910, they sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before. Xavier was 72 now, Thea 69, and they had been married for 32 years. 3 decades of partnership, of love, of building a life together. "You ever think about how it all started?" Xavier asked, though he knew the answer. They had told the story so many times to their children and grandchildren, it had become almost mythical in the family lore. "All the time," Thea said, smiling. "I think about how desperate I was, how lost I felt. And then you walked in, this big, intimidating mountain man with kind eyes. And you ate my terrible bread like it was a gift." "It was a gift," Xavier said seriously. "It was the gift of meeting you." Thea laughed, the sound still able to make Xavier's heart lift. "Even after all these years, you can still make me feel like that young widow who did not know how to bake bread. And you can still make me feel like that lonely mountain man who did not know what he was missing," Xavier replied. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set, their hands linked together as they always were. So many sunsets they had watched together, so many moments shared, so many memories made. "Xavier," Thea said softly. "Yes, love. I would do it all again, you know. Every moment, every trial, every triumph. I would choose you every single time." Xavier brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "And I would choose you. 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times I would choose you." As darkness fell softly around them, they sat together in peace, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds. From burnt bread to this moment, from tears to laughter, from strangers to soulmates. It had been a journey worth taking, a love worth fighting for. Xavier Pike, once a lonely mountain man who thought he needed nothing but his solitude, had found his heaven. Not in some distant place or future dream, but right here in this life with this woman. And Thea, once a desperate widow crying over burnt bread, had found her salvation. Not in her own strength, though she had proven to have plenty of that, but in opening her heart to love again. Together, they had built something extraordinary out of the most ordinary moments. A life, a family, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. And it all started with burnt bread that a kind mountain man had said tasted like heaven. Because sometimes, Xavier thought as he held his wife's hand in the gathering darkness, heaven is not some far-off place. Sometimes it is right here in the life you create, in the love you share, in the simple act of being exactly where you are supposed to be, with exactly who you are supposed to be with. And that, he knew with absolute certainty, was exactly what he had found. Heaven in every sense of the word. Their story became the stuff of legend in Fort Benton, told and retold with each generation. The mountain man and the widow who started with burnt bread and built an empire of love. Their descendants prospered, carrying on the trading posts and the ranch, always remembering the legacy of hard work, kindness, and love that Xavier and Thea had established. Xavier and Thea lived to see their great-grandchildren born, delighting in each new addition to their growing family tree. They remained deeply in love until the very end, never taking for granted the gift they had been given in finding each other. When Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1915 at the age of 77, Thea held his hand and whispered that she would see him soon. True to her word, she followed him just 3 months later, dying quietly in the house they had built together, surrounded by the family they had created. Their children buried them side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, with a simple stone marker that read, Xavier Pike and Thea Pike together in life. Together in death. Heaven was in every moment shared, but beneath that, added by their children, was a single line that captured the essence of their love story. It all started with burnt bread, and indeed it had. One moment of failure transformed into a lifetime of love. One act of kindness rippling out to change not just 2 lives, but generations of lives. One mountain man brave enough to walk through a door and taste heaven in the form of terrible bread and a woman's grateful tears. The trading posts that bore the Pike name continued to operate for decades after their deaths, eventually becoming a small chain of general stores throughout Montana. The ranch remained in the family, passed down from generation to generation. And always, the story was told of how it all began, of Xavier and Thea and burnt bread and love that lasted a lifetime. In the end, that is what mattered. Not the empire they built or the wealth they accumulated or even the legacy they left behind. What mattered was the love they shared, the life they created together, the simple truth that 2 broken people found each other and became whole. Xavier had been right all those years ago on their anniversary. One day, one moment, one decision really could change everything. The decision to knock on a door. The decision to tell a white lie about terrible bread. The decision to let someone in despite all the reasons to stay closed off and protected. Those decisions, small in the moment, had created something magnificent. A love story for the ages, a testament to the power of kindness and compassion, and opening your heart to possibility. And somewhere, in whatever heaven they believed in, Xavier and Thea were together still, holding hands and watching sunsets and sharing the kind of love that transcends time and death. The kind of love that starts with burnt bread and ends never, because true love has no ending. Just eternal beginnings, one moment of heaven at a time.